Rachel Thompson had finally done it. After years of renting cramped apartments with paper-thin walls, she'd bought her first house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom place in Meadowbrook Heights, but it was hers. The neighborhood seemed perfect at first glance. Neat lawns, quiet streets, and friendly waves from people washing their cars on Saturday mornings. Moving day was chaos. Boxes everywhere, furniture that somehow looked bigger than it did in her old place, and a mountain of bubble wrap that seemed to multiply on its own. By evening, Rachel was exhausted. She'd managed to get the essentials inside, but a few boxes still sat on her driveway. She figured she'd grab them first thing in the morning. That's when she met Frank Morrison. The knock on her door came at exactly 6:15 p.m. Rachel answered, still wearing her dusty moving clothes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. A tall man in his 60s stood on her porch, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and he held a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Good evening. Frank Morrison, HOA president." He didn't smile. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Heights. I'm here to inform you of a violation." Rachel blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Frank gestured toward her driveway. "Those boxes. Section 4.2 of our community bylaws states that all moving materials must be removed from visible areas by 6 p.m. on moving day. It's now 6:15. She looked at the 3 boxes sitting harmlessly on her driveway, then back at Frank. "Oh, I didn't know. I'll bring them in right now. I'm afraid I still need to issue a written warning. First offense is just a warning, but repeated violations result in fines." He pulled out a pre-printed form and began filling it out. Rachel felt her stomach sink. She'd been in the house for less than 12 hours. "Look, I really didn't mean to break any rules. I'm happy to move them right now." "Rules are rules, Ms. Thompson. They apply to everyone equally." Frank finished writing, tore off a copy, and handed it to her. "Please familiarize yourself with the community handbook. You should have received one at closing." She had received it. The thing was about 50 pages long, and she'd planned to read it over the weekend. "I will. Thank you." Frank nodded curtly and walked back to his car, a pristine luxury sedan parked across the street. Rachel watched him go, feeling a knot of anxiety form in her chest. She grabbed the boxes and hauled them inside, suddenly feeling less excited about her new home. Over the next week, Rachel tried to settle in. She arranged furniture, hung pictures, and started her new job at the community college where she'd be teaching history. The work was good, her colleagues were friendly, and she loved working with students. It helped take her mind off the weird welcome she'd gotten from Frank. She kept a low profile in the neighborhood. Smiled and waved at her neighbors during her morning runs, but didn't push for conversation. That was just her way. Rachel had always been on the quieter side, preferring to observe before jumping into new social situations. Her friends back home used to joke that she was secretly a ninja because of how quietly she moved through life. They weren't entirely wrong about the ninja part, though they'd never actually seen that side of her. Rachel had started karate when she was 8 years old. A shy kid who got picked on at school, her mom had enrolled her in classes hoping it would boost her confidence. It did more than that. She fell in love with the discipline, the focus, the way her mind and body worked together. By college, she was competing in national tournaments. She'd won medals, earned her 3rd-degree black belt, and even taught classes at her dojo. Then came the injury. A torn ligament during a championship match that required surgery and months of physical therapy. By the time she healed, she'd lost her competitive edge and her passion for tournaments. She still practiced occasionally, still had the skills, but she'd moved on to other things. Teaching history felt safer, quieter. These days, most people who met Rachel saw a bookish teacher who liked plants and kept to herself. That was fine with her. 2 weeks after moving in, Rachel came home to find another notice on her door. This time, Frank claimed her mailbox was the wrong color. According to the bylaws, mailboxes must be classic black, shade number 2319. Hers, apparently, was shade 2320. She stood in her driveway staring at the mailbox, trying to see the difference. It looked black, just black. The notice included a $50 fine if she didn't repaint it within 2 weeks. Rachel felt frustration bubble up but pushed it down. Fine. She'd repaint the stupid mailbox. It wasn't worth fighting over. She went to the hardware store, found the exact shade required, and spent her Saturday afternoon repainting. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Betty Rodriguez, came over while she was working. "Don't worry, dear. He does this to everyone," Betty said, shaking her head. "Frank thinks he runs this place like his personal kingdom. Those of us who've been here a while just try to stay off his radar." "Has he always been like this?" Rachel asked, wiping paint from her hands. Betty nodded. "Got worse after he retired. I think he's bored and this gives him something to do. Just keep your head down, follow the rules exactly, and hopefully he'll leave you alone." Rachel thanked her for the advice, but something about the whole situation bothered her. She'd bought this house to finally have her own space, her own peace. Instead, she felt like she was walking on eggshells. That night, Rachel unpacked a box she'd been avoiding. Inside was her old karate uniform, neatly folded, and a photo from her last tournament. She looked at her younger self, focused and powerful, standing in the winner's circle with a gold medal around her neck. That person seemed so far away now. She folded the uniform back up and put the box in her closet. That was another life. These days, she was just trying to live quietly and avoid trouble. But as she'd learned soon enough, some trouble doesn't care if you're trying to avoid it. The mailbox incident was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, Frank found something wrong with Rachel's property almost weekly. First, it was her garden gnome. She'd placed a small ceramic gnome near her rosebush, thinking it looked cheerful. Frank called it unauthorized decorative items not in keeping with community standards. Another $75 fine. Then came the parking situation. Rachel's driveway was slightly sloped, and one morning her car had rolled back about 2 inches while she ran inside to grab her forgotten lunch. 2 inches over the property line. Frank happened to drive by at that exact moment, took a photo, and left another notice. This time, $100. Rachel started keeping a folder. Every notice, every fine, every interaction. She photographed everything, noted dates and times. Her teaching background had taught her the importance of documentation. At first, she paid the fines without complaint, hoping Frank would eventually lose interest and move on to someone else. He didn't. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the constant anxiety. Every time Rachel left for work, she'd double-check everything. Was her trash can visible from the street? Were her curtains the approved color? Was her car exactly centered in the driveway? She started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night wondering what Frank would find wrong next. Her colleague at the college, David, noticed she seemed stressed during lunch one day. "You okay? You've been pretty quiet lately." Rachel stirred her coffee, debating whether to explain. "Just some neighbor stuff. Nothing major." "The HOA?" David guessed. "My sister lives in one of those neighborhoods. Says it's like living with a hall monitor who never grew up." That was exactly what it felt like. Rachel managed a tired smile. "Pretty much." Things came to a head on a Tuesday evening. Rachel arrived home to find yet another notice, but this one was different. Frank was demanding she remove her decorative wind chimes because they created excessive noise pollution. The wind chimes made a soft, pleasant sound in the breeze. She'd bought them because they reminded her of her grandmother's porch. This time, something inside Rachel shifted. She'd been patient. She'd been compliant. She'd followed every ridiculous rule, but this felt personal. Like Frank was just looking for reasons to harass her. She decided to attend the next HOA meeting and contest the charge. The monthly meeting was held in the community center, a bland room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. About 20 residents showed up, most of them older folks who'd lived in Meadowbrook Heights for years. Rachel signed in and took a seat near the back. Frank ran the meeting like a corporate board session, going through old business and financial reports in a monotone voice. When they reached the open comment period, Rachel raised her hand. "Yes, Ms. Thompson," Frank said, not quite looking at her. Rachel stood, folder in hand. "I'd like to contest the violation notice I received about my wind chimes. The bylaws mention noise ordinances, but they specifically reference mechanical sounds and loud music. Wind chimes are decorative items used in many homes in this community. The board has determined that your wind chimes violate Section 7.3, Frank said flatly. "Next comment?" "Wait, I'm not finished," Rachel said, keeping her voice steady. "I've received 8 violation notices in 3 months. I've paid over $400 in fines, but I've noticed that other homes have similar items that aren't being cited. Mrs. Rodriguez has wind chimes. The Andersons have a garden statue. The Chens have—" "Ms. Thompson," Frank interrupted, his voice sharp. "Those residents have been part of this community for years. They understand our standards. You're new here, and frankly, You seem to have difficulty following simple rules." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rachel felt heat rise to her face, but she kept her composure. Years of standing in front of judges at karate tournaments had taught her to control her emotions under pressure, to stay centered when someone tried to throw her off balance. "I'm following the rules exactly as written," she said calmly. "What I'm questioning is whether they're being applied fairly." Frank's jaw tightened. "This meeting is not a courtroom, Ms. Thompson. If you have concerns, you can submit them in writing. Now, if there are no other comment—" He looked around the room, making it clear Rachel's time was up. Rachel sat down, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from frustration. Betty caught her eye from across the room and gave her a sympathetic look. After the meeting ended, Betty pulled her aside in the parking lot. "That took guts," Betty said quietly. "Nobody's challenged Frank in years." "What happened to the people who did?" Rachel asked. Betty sighed. "They either sold their houses and left, or they learned to keep their heads down. Frank holds grudges. Once you're on his radar, he doesn't let up." "Great," Rachel muttered. "There's something else you should know," Betty added, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Frank's been telling people at the community center that you're causing trouble, that you're difficult to work with. He's been spreading these little comments, nothing you could really call him out on, but it's created this impression." Rachel felt her stomach drop. She'd worked so hard to build a good reputation at the college, to be seen as professional and reliable. Now Frank was trying to damage her standing in her own neighborhood before she'd even had a chance to make friends. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the meeting in her head, feeling embarrassed by how Frank had dismissed her in front of everyone. She got up around midnight and went to her spare room, the one she'd been using for storage. In the corner was a heavy bag she'd brought from her old apartment but never unpacked. She'd bought it years ago for training at home. Now she pushed aside boxes and hung it from the ceiling mount she'd installed but never used. She wrapped her hands carefully, the motion automatic after all these years. Then she started hitting the bag. Slow at first, remembering the forms, the breathing, the way power came from your core and traveled through your body. Jab, cross, hook. The rhythm came back to her like muscle memory. With each strike, she felt some of the tension release. She'd spent 3 months trying to be invisible, trying not to make waves, but Frank had noticed her anyway. He'd targeted her anyway. Being quiet and compliant hadn't protected her at all. Rachel stopped, breathing hard, her hands tingling from the impact. She looked at the bag swinging gently in the dim light. Maybe it was time to stop avoiding conflict. Maybe it was time to remember who she used to be. Not the fighter in the ring, but the person who stood her ground with confidence. She unwrapped her hands and went back to bed. This time she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The notice arrived on a Thursday morning. Rachel was running late for work when she found the envelope taped to her front door. She almost ignored it, but something about the official HOA letterhead made her stop. She tore it open right there on her porch. Her blood ran cold as she read it. Frank was demanding she remove her Japanese maple tree, the beautiful tree in her front yard with its delicate red leaves. According to the notice, it wasn't on the approved plant species list and violated Section 12.4 of the landscaping guidelines. She had 48 hours to have it removed, or she'd face a $5,000 fine. $5,000. Rachel stared at the tree. It had been there when she bought the house. The real estate listing had even mentioned it as a selling point. She'd fallen in love with how the morning light filtered through its branches. Now Frank wanted it gone. She called in sick to work and spent the morning digging through her closing documents. Sure enough, the tree was visible in photos from the original listing dated 10 years ago. The previous owners had planted it. This wasn't something she'd done wrong. The tree had been there longer than Frank had been HOA president. Rachel drove straight to Betty's house and knocked on her door. Betty answered in her gardening gloves, looking surprised. "I need your help," Rachel said, showing her the notice. "This tree was here before I moved in. Frank can't make me remove it, can he?" Betty read the notice and shook her head slowly. "That tree has been there since the Johnsons lived in your house. I remember when they planted it." "Frank knows that. Then why is he doing this?" "Because you challenged him at the meeting," Betty said quietly. "Frank doesn't forgive that kind of thing. Come on, let's go talk to him." Rachel felt a surge of gratitude. Betty had seemed scared of Frank before, but now she was willing to stand up for what was right. They walked together to Frank's house, a large colonial at the end of the street with a perfect lawn that looked like it had been trimmed with scissors. Frank answered the door, looking annoyed. "Can I help you?" "Frank, that tree has been in Rachel's yard since the Johnsons planted it in 2015, Betty said firmly. "It was grandfathered in. You can't make her remove it now." Frank's expression hardened. "The bylaws are clear. Non-approved vegetation must be removed. It doesn't matter when it was planted." "But it was there before I bought the house," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice level. "I have photos from the original listing." "Then the previous owner should have been cited," Frank said coldly. "But they're gone. You're the current owner, which makes it your responsibility. 48 hours, Ms. Thompson." He started to close the door. "This is ridiculous," Betty said, her voice rising. "You're just targeting her because she stood up to you." Frank turned back and his face had changed. The polite mask was gone, replaced by something harder. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I suggest you stay out of this unless you want me to start paying closer attention to your property. I notice your fence posts are looking a bit weathered. Section 9.2 requires all fencing to be maintained in good condition." Betty went pale. Rachel could see the fear flash across her face. "Don't threaten her," Rachel said, and something in her tone made Frank's eyes narrow. "It's not a threat. It's a reminder that rules apply to everyone." He looked at Betty. "Even longtime residents." Then he closed the door in their faces. Betty was shaking as they walked back down the driveway. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I shouldn't have come. I just made things worse." "No, you tried to help. This isn't your fault." But Rachel felt guilty. Betty had stuck her neck out, and now she was being threatened too. That evening, Rachel found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. No signature, just 3 words in block letters: "You don't belong." Her hands trembled as she held it. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was personal. She looked around the parking area, but it was empty. Someone had left this while she was at the grocery store. Someone had been watching her. Rachel went inside and locked her door, feeling truly unsettled for the first time since moving in. She'd dealt with difficult people before, but this felt different. Threatening. The note wasn't overtly aggressive, but the message was clear. "Get out." She tried to focus on grading papers, but couldn't concentrate. Her phone buzzed with a text from David at work. "Hey, someone asked me today if you were having trouble adjusting to the neighborhood." Seemed like a weird question. "Everything okay?" Rachel's stomach sank. Frank was spreading rumors beyond the neighborhood now. Somehow he'd reached people at the college. She typed back a quick response saying everything was fine, but her mind was racing. How did Frank even know where she worked? Had he been asking around about her? The next morning, she discovered someone had egged her car during the night. Yellow yolk dripped down the windshield and dried on the paint. Rachel stood in her driveway at 6 a.m. in her pajamas, staring at the mess, and something inside her snapped. Not in an explosive way. In a focused way, like a switch flipping. She cleaned the car slowly, methodically, and with each swipe of the sponge, she felt herself changing. She'd spent months trying to be invisible, trying not to cause problems, trying to fit into a place that clearly didn't want her. And where had that gotten her? Harassed, threatened, and covered in egg. Rachel went back inside and pulled out that box from her closet. Her karate uniform, her old tournament medals, photos of her younger self standing proud and confident. That person hadn't been afraid of anything. That person had faced down opponents twice her size and won through skill, strategy, and unshakable focus. She'd let that person fade away after the injury, telling herself she was moving on to a quieter life. But maybe quiet wasn't always the answer. Maybe there were times when you needed to stand up and take up space, to show people they couldn't push you around. Rachel pulled on her old training clothes and went to her spare room where the heavy bag hung. This time, her movements were sharper, more precise. She worked through old kata forms, feeling her body remember patterns she'd practiced 10,000 times. Block, strike, pivot, breathe. With each movement, she felt clearer. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger. Not anger exactly. More like determination, resolve. The same feeling she used to get before stepping into the competition ring. That calm certainty that she could handle whatever came next. She'd been treating the situation like something she needed to survive. But she'd forgotten the most important lesson her sensei had taught her all those years ago. A true martial artist doesn't fight to win. They fight to protect what matters, Their home, their peace, their dignity. Rachel stopped mid-strike and let her hands fall to her sides. Her breath came steady and even. The morning light filtered through the window, and in that moment she made a decision. She wasn't leaving. This was her home, and she wasn't going to keep letting Frank push her around. But she also wasn't going to meet his aggression with more aggression. That wasn't the way. Instead, she was going to use everything her years of training had taught her: patience, strategy, awareness, and unshakable confidence. Frank had no idea who he was really dealing with. And it was time he found out. Rachel spent the weekend doing something she should have done months ago. She read the entire HOA handbook. Every single page. And what she found was eye-opening. Frank had been breaking his own rules. According to the bylaws, any fine over $200 required a vote from the full board, not just the president. Frank had issued multiple fines above that amount without any board approval. There were also specific procedures for how violations should be reported and appealed. Frank had ignored all of them, acting like a one-man judge and jury. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. Rachel started looking at the HOA's publicly posted financial statements from the past 3 years. The numbers didn't quite add up. Money collected from fines didn't match the amounts reported in the budget. Thousands of dollars seemed to have just vanished. She wasn't an accountant, but she knew enough to recognize something fishy when she saw it. Rachel printed everything out and started making calls. First to Betty, who gave her phone numbers for other neighbors who'd had run-ins with Frank. Then she reached out to them one by one. What she discovered surprised her. The Hendersons had been fined $800 for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue. They'd paid it to avoid trouble. The Patels had been cited for having their trash can visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they'd been at work and couldn't move it until evening. $150. The Wilsons had been threatened with legal action over a decorative bird bath. Everyone had a story. Everyone had paid up and stayed quiet, assuming that was the only option. Rachel invited them all to Betty's house on Tuesday evening. 8 neighbors showed up, sitting in Betty's living room with coffee mugs and nervous expressions. At first, nobody wanted to talk. Years of Frank's intimidation had made them cautious. "Look," Rachel said, spreading out her documents on the coffee table. "I know everyone's scared, I am too. But Frank has been violating the rules he's supposed to be enforcing. These fines he's issuing, most of them aren't even legal according to our own bylaws." She showed them the financial discrepancies, the missing money, the procedural violations. Slowly, people started opening up. One neighbor mentioned that Frank's friend, who lived 2 streets over, had a massive satellite dish that violated the same rules Frank had cited others for. Another pointed out that Frank's own lawn decorations exceeded the size limits he enforced on everyone else. "So what do we do?" Mr. Henderson asked. "Frank's been president for 6 years. The board always votes the way he tells them to. We document everything," Rachel said. "Every violation he's committed, every rule he's broken, every discrepancy in the finances. And we present it at the next meeting." "He'll just shut you down again," Mrs. Wilson said quietly. "Like he did last time." Rachel met her eyes. "Not if all of us speak up together. He can silence one person. He can't silence everyone." The group agreed to gather evidence over the next 2 weeks. Photos, receipts, violation notices, everything. Rachel felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. She wasn't alone in this anymore, but Frank wasn't done with her yet. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening. Rachel had just gotten home from the college and was checking her mail when Frank's car pulled up. He got out and walked straight toward her, his face red with anger. "I know what you're doing," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Meeting with the neighbors, spreading lies about me." Rachel stood her ground, mail still in her hand. "I'm not spreading lies. I'm sharing facts. You're trying to turn people against me." Frank took a step closer. "I've worked hard to maintain standards in this community. I won't let some outsider come in and undermine everything. I'm not an outsider. I live here." Rachel kept her voice calm, but she could feel her heart racing. "And maintaining standards doesn't mean harassing people or taking their money illegally." Frank's jaw clenched. "Illegally? You have no idea what you're talking about." "Actually, I do." Rachel didn't back away even as Frank moved closer. "The bylaws require board votes for major fines. You've been issuing them on your own. The financial records don't match up. Money's missing. How dare you?" Frank's voice was rising now. He stepped even closer. well inside her personal space, clearly trying to intimidate her. "You've been here for 5 minutes and you think you can—" "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to step back." Something in Rachel's voice changed. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The same tone she'd used when teaching students, when commanding respect in the dojo. Calm but absolutely firm. Frank hesitated, seeming to realize for the first time that Rachel wasn't shrinking away from him like everyone else did. She stood completely still, balanced on her feet, shoulders relaxed but posture perfect. Her eyes never left his face. "You need to calm down," Frank said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I am calm," Rachel replied evenly. "You're the one who's yelling and invading my personal space. I've asked you politely to step back." A car pulled up across the street. Mrs. Patel was coming home from work. She got out slowly, clearly watching the confrontation. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Frank noticed and his whole demeanor changed. The aggressive posture melted away. "This isn't over," he said, but he was already backing toward his car. "No, it's not," Rachel agreed. "The next HOA meeting is in 5 days. I'll see you there." Frank drove off faster than the neighborhood speed limit allowed. Rachel's hands were shaking, but not from fear. Adrenaline. She'd stood her ground and hadn't flinched, even when Frank tried to intimidate her with his physical presence. Mrs. Patel crossed the street, still holding her phone. "I got the whole thing." He was completely out of line. "Thank you," Rachel said gratefully. "No, thank you. Someone needed to stand up to him. I should have done it years ago." Mrs. Patel smiled. "My husband told me something interesting today. He works at the hardware store. Frank's been buying the exact paint colors he cites people for violations on. He's been making people repaint things that were already the right color." Rachel felt anger flash through her, but she breathed through it. Getting emotional wouldn't help. "Staying focused would. Can your husband document that? Receipts, purchase history? I'll ask him tonight." Over the next few days, more neighbors came forward. Some with stories, others with evidence. The Chens found old HOA meeting minutes that showed Frank approving expenses without proper votes. Mr. Wilson discovered that Frank had hired his own landscaping company to do HOA property maintenance at inflated prices. The picture became clearer with each piece of evidence. Frank had been running the HOA like his personal fiefdom, enriching himself and his friends while terrorizing anyone who questioned him. Rachel compiled everything into a presentation. Charts, documents, photos, testimonies. She practiced what she'd say, keeping it factual and unemotional. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. She got up and practiced forms in her spare room, moving through the familiar patterns. Each movement centered her, reminded her of her training. You don't fight out of anger. You fight to protect what matters. Tomorrow, she'd walk into that meeting with confidence. Not because she wasn't nervous, but because she'd done the work. She had the truth on her side. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. Frank had underestimated her from the start. He'd seen a quiet woman who kept to herself and assumed she'd be easy to push around. He had no idea that beneath that quiet exterior was someone who'd spent years learning how to face down opponents without flinching. Tomorrow, he'd find out exactly who Rachel Thompson really was. The community center was packed. Rachel arrived 15 minutes early and still barely found a seat. Word had spread about the meeting. Neighbors who hadn't attended in years were there, filling every chair and lining the walls. The energy in the room felt different, charged. Frank sat at the front table with the other board members, shuffling papers and pretending not to notice the unusual turnout. But Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched. He knew something was coming. The meeting started normally. Minutes from last month, treasurer's report, old business. Frank's voice was clipped and formal. He was rushing through the agenda, clearly trying to get to adjourn me. When they reached open comments, Rachel raised her hand. So did Betty, and Mrs. Patel and Mr. Henderson and 6 other people scattered throughout the room. Frank's face went pale. "Ms. Thompson, you have the floor." Rachel stood carrying a folder thick with documents. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She'd faced judges at tournaments who were looking for any sign of weakness. She knew how to project calm even when nerves were screaming inside her. "Thank you. I'm here tonight to present evidence of serious violations of our HOA bylaws and potential financial misconduct." Her voice carried clearly through the room. No shaking, no hesitation. Over the past 4 months, I've been issued multiple fines by President Morrison. During that time, I discovered that many of these fines violate our own rules. She pulled out the first document. Section 15.2 states that any fine exceeding $200 requires a vote from the full board. President Morrison has issued fines up to $5,000 without board approval. I have copies of these violations for the board to review. Frank stood up abruptly. This is not the appropriate forum for, I'm not finished. Rachel didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made Frank pause. Section 18.4 requires that all violation appeals be heard within 30 days. Multiple residents have submitted appeals that were never addressed. I have those documented as well. She handed copies to the board members who were now leaning forward with interest. One of them, Mrs. Chen, started flipping through the pages with a frown. But the most serious issue, Rachel continued, is the financial irregularities. According to the quarterly reports posted on the HOA website, $27,000 in fines were collected over the past 2 years. However, only $14,000 appears in the budget allocations. That's $13,000 that's unaccounted for. The room erupted in whispers. Frank's face had gone from pale to red. These are baseless accusations. I've maintained meticulous records. Then you won't mind an independent audit, Betty said, standing up from her seat. I move that we conduct a full financial audit of the HOA accounts. Seconded, Mr. Henderson called out. This is highly irregular, Frank sputtered. You can't just… Actually, we can, Mrs. Chen said from the board table. She was reading through the bylaws. Any resident can motion for an audit. It requires a simple majority vote from members present. She looked at Frank with cold eyes. I vote yes for the audit. The other 2 board members quickly voted yes as well. Frank was outnumbered. Furthermore, Rachel said, I have documentation that President Morrison has been selectively enforcing rules, citing some residents while ignoring identical violations by others. She gestured to Mrs. Patel. Would you like to share what your husband discovered? Mrs. Patel stood. My husband works at the hardware store. Frank has been purchasing paint in the exact colors required by HOA rules, then citing residents for using the wrong shade, even when they're already compliant. He's been forcing people to buy new paint unnecessarily. The whispers grew louder. Frank looked around the room like a cornered animal. You people don't understand the work that goes into maintaining this community. The standards I've upheld, by harassing residents? Mr. Wilson stood up. By threatening anyone who questions you? By making people afraid to hang a wind chime in their own yard? More people started standing, sharing their stories. The floodgates had opened. Years of intimidation and fear were spilling out. Frank tried to interrupt several times, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd. Then Frank made a mistake. He stood up fast, his chair scraping loudly, and started walking toward Rachel with his finger pointed. This is all because of you. You've been here 5 months and you've… Mr. Morrison, stop right there. Rachel's voice cut through the noise like a blade, not loud but commanding. Everyone went quiet. Frank was halfway across the room, his body language aggressive, fingers still jabbing toward her, but Rachel stood completely still, feet shoulder-width apart, posture relaxed but somehow unmovable. I've asked you twice now to respect personal space, Rachel said calmly. The last time it was recorded. This time there are 50 witnesses. Frank seemed to realize where he was, what he was doing. In front of the entire community, he'd lost control. He stopped walking but didn't back down. You think you can come into my community and… It's not your community, Mrs. Chen interrupted from the board table. It's our community. And frankly, Frank, I've been on this board for 3 years and I'm just now realizing how many decisions you've made without consulting us. I move for a vote of no confidence in the HOA president, Betty said clearly. Seconded, said at least 5 voices at once. The vote was overwhelming. 32 residents voted to remove Frank as president. Only Frank himself and 2 of his friends voted no. Frank stood there for a long moment, his face going through a range of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and finally something that looked like defeat. You'll regret this, he said quietly, but there was no power behind the words anymore. The only thing I regret, Rachel said, is not standing up to you sooner. Frank grabbed his papers and left, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room. After the door closed behind him, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then someone started clapping. Soon the whole room joined in. Mrs. Chen looked at Rachel. We need to nominate a new president. Rachel, would you… Thank you, but no, Rachel said with a smile. I just wanted my peaceful home back. Besides, I think Betty would be excellent. Betty looked shocked. Me? You've lived here for 20 years and you've always looked out for your neighbors, Rachel said. Even when it was scary. That's real leadership. Betty was elected unanimously. After the meeting, neighbors clustered around Rachel, thanking her, asking questions. One of them, Mr. Patel, looked at her curiously. The way you handled yourself tonight, that confidence. You have training in something, don't you? Rachel smiled. I used to teach karate. 3rd-degree black belt, actually. But I haven't competed in years. That explains a lot, Mrs. Wilson said. The way you stood your ground when Frank tried to intimidate you. I've never seen anyone face him down like that. Martial arts isn't really about fighting, Rachel said. It's about confidence, discipline, and knowing your own strength. Sometimes just standing firm is enough. Over the next few weeks, the audit revealed exactly what Rachel had suspected. Frank had been pocketing money from fines and giving contracts to his own business. The HOA filed a formal complaint, and Frank quietly moved out of the neighborhood rather than face the consequences. The community changed almost overnight. New board members were elected. Unfair fines were refunded. The bylaws were revised to include proper oversight and appeals processes. Rachel's Japanese maple tree stayed right where it was, beautiful and undisturbed. And Rachel finally got what she'd wanted all along, a peaceful home where she could just live her life. She still practiced her forms in the spare room most mornings, still had that quiet strength about her, but now her neighbors saw her differently. Not as an easy target or an outsider, but as someone who'd reminded them all that standing up for what's right isn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes it's just about refusing to back down, staying calm under pressure, and knowing your own worth. Those were lessons she'd learned on the mat years ago. She was glad she'd remembered them when it mattered most.